Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Finance for Biodiversity and Nature Action 100 webinar. We're discussing today the investor engagement sector brief that we've published on forestry, paper and packaging sector, which is one of the 8 priority sectors covered by the Nature Action 100 initiative. And I'm delighted to have a couple of speakers with me today who are going to sort of assist providing insights into the sector itself and some of the actions that companies can be taking. Shelley Vinyard from NRDC is going to be talking about sustainable forestry, which is clearly one of the priorities in terms of the sort of the upstream part of the sector and the inputs into the system more broadly. And then Arthur van Mansvelt from Achmea Investment Management is going to be talking about some of the actions that his organization has taken in terms of engaging with companies towards the downstream end of the system in the packaging part of the process, and particularly around some of the issues with plastics. So delighted to have both of them with us today. Thank you very much to them for joining us. In terms of the agenda for this afternoon, we'll hand over to Shelley in a minute to talk about specifically sustainable forestry management as one of the key actions that can be taken by companies in this sector. I'll then pick up the baton and talk about the investor brief itself, what's in it, how you can use it, why we published it, give you a few more insights into that document itself. And then I'll hand over to Arthur to talk about some of the lessons learned from their engagements with companies in this sector. We will have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. So if you do have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up towards the end. Or of course, you're very welcome to just take yourself off mute and shout out a question at the end of the webinar, aiming for 1 hour max. So we'll see how it goes. But with no further ado, I would be very keen to hand over to Shelley and leave her to talk about sustainable forest management. So Shelley, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and I will hand over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Peter, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So Peter invited me here to talk about sustainable forest management, which is a term that I'm sure many of you have encountered in your engagements or in reviewing corporate sustainability policies. And what I'm going to do today is just provide some context behind the term, where it came from, some of the, provide some clarity about what it means, what it doesn't mean, and what investors can look for when you see that term or when you are in conversation with companies. So you can go to the next slide, Peter. Keep going, one more, sorry. So first, just to take a step back, sustainable forest management, the bottom line of what is sustainable forest management is that it is actually a very malleable term, and it's not very well defined. The term took hold back in the early 90s with the Montreal process, which was designed to create criteria and indicators for how to have sustainable forestry in temperate and boreal forests. However, in the last 35 years since the Montreal process was established, there hasn't been as much unified agreement or clarity around what it actually means and what should be assessed country to country. And so, as you can see here, I mean, there have been numerous scientific studies that have called out the fact that, different countries approach the measurement and reporting of sustainable forest management and regulation of sustainable forest management differently. And within the term, even sustainable forest management, you can go to the next slide, Peter. Excuse me. There's an inherent tension because the idea is that there's a desire from the forestry industry to have sustained harvest in order to meet global demand for forestry products, but that is inherently and often in conflict with ecosystem integrity, and without taking into consideration the financial impacts of degrading ecosystems, we end up having a system that facilitates or leans more on the sustained harvest side without actually balancing the impacts to ecosystems. So where we are now, you can go to the next slide. The Montreal process does set out criteria and indicators for countries to monitor and report on sustainable forest management. However, those reporting, what countries actually do is open to interpretation, and reporting and monitoring varies widely by country. And not only that, different countries use different definitions for what they're actually assessing and monitoring. There's widespread use of third-party certification in boreal and temperate forest countries, which means that, it's in some ways an outsourcing of the assessment and monitoring of what's happening on the ground in these forests to third-party certification entities. There's also very limited regulation of forest degradation. Whereas most countries have laws that limit or prohibit deforestation, which is in the technical sense the conversion of forests into some other land use, all of the other impacts that come from industrial forestry activities, like road building, species biodiversity impacts that happen from the logging impacts, carbon emissions, increased flood risk, increased wildfire risk, those are not adequately reflected in sustainable forest management and adequately monitored or assessed or regulated. And at the same time, because sustainable forest management sounds nice on paper, the term is found in both government policies and in corporate supply chain policies. So, I do a lot of work with companies to improve their supply chain sourcing and practices. And, I will see policies quite often that say, we prioritize sustainable forest management in our supply chain with our suppliers, but there's very little explanation of, well, what are you actually looking for when you say you prioritize sustainable forest management? Next slide. So this is third-party certification in particular is tricky. And as I spoke about earlier, it's when the government kind of pushes the role of monitoring sustainable forest management into third-party certification, it inherently means that there's going to be a lot more room for interpretation and a wider spectrum of the types of activities that are allowed. And this is NRDC's approach and recommendations to how to think about third-party certification when you see it in your engagements. Red light means, big red flags if a company doesn't have any sort of reliance on third-party certification at all. Likewise, there's actually a quite significant difference between different certification systems. So the Sustainable Forestry Initiative and PEFC were actually developed after the establishment of the Forest Stewardship Council, and both their governance and their approach to the requirements on the ground require a lot less rigor than the Forest Stewardship Council. And so if a company doesn't have a preference for the Forest Forest Stewardship Council certification, that should be another signal that you as asset managers should dig deeper about the types of practices that they might be enabling in their supply chain. The Forest Stewardship Council is the gold standard for third-party certification because of its governance. It brings together indigenous communities, the industry, it's the economic sector, the environmental and NGO experts, to work together on a common agreed upon standard. But that really should not be the end all be all. There are many companies that say, we want to achieve 100% third-party certification and have a preference for FSC. That's really insufficient, especially given what we know about the threats that forests are facing today. And really the best practices for companies is to prioritize and prefer Forest Stewardship Council third-party certification, but also have additional criteria and monitoring and due diligence that they report on and demonstrate themselves. So let's go to the next slide. So these are the types of things that you want to look for when you're engaging with a company who has a forest product supply chain. Really, there should be a lot of specificity and clarity of the definitions that they're relying on, how they, we recommend the accountability framework initiatives, definitions of deforestation and forest degradation and conversion as really useful evidence-based definitions that companies should adopt and use to implement their supply chain policies. They should be reporting at least annually on volumes purchased, their geographic sourcing footprint, their mills, their certification breakdown. They should have demonstrated non-compliance protocol and evidence that they've actually put it to use. And another really big one is lobbying. A frequent dynamic that we see with companies that have a forest product footprint is that they may have policies themselves that establish some level of rigor, but they're members of industry trade groups that are actively lobbying to weaken the very policies that would mitigate risk in their supply chain. So for a great example of this is industry trade group engagement on the EU deforestation regulation, where the American Forest and Paper Association and the Forest Products Association of Canada have been quite aggressively working to weaken and limit the scope of the regulation and work to delay it. And, if you look at who's members of those groups, it includes some of the major some of the largest forestry and paper and packaging companies in North America. And so it's really important to push companies on their membership in those trade groups, because really that's a direct conflict between what their purported interests are and what your interests are as asset managers, and what their trade groups are actively pushing for. Next slide. So there are also some other questions. So those are kind of the categories to dig deeper into. There are also other questions that you can ask that can illuminate the depth of engagement and scrutiny that a company is applying on its supply chain. Do they have commitments to reduce sourcing from specific forests? What does their supply chain monitoring look like? How do they assess biodiversity-related risks and dependencies? And how often do they report on their sourcing? I will note that NRDC and Whistle Stop Capital actually recently launched a tool called Forest Clarity, where we dig into this and a lot of other issues related to sustainable forest management, particularly when it comes to sourcing from northern forests. And so if you want to learn more about these how you can have a more informed engagement on these dynamics, please do utilize that tool, and we're really eager for questions and feedback on that as well. I think that is, yes, so these are some of the resources, and I think that is it for me.
Thank you very much indeed, Shelley. That's really helpful. Great to sort of have some really practical discussion around what actually sustainable forestry entails, and some of the sort of the issues that are associated with that. So what I'd like to do now is to continue the discussion focusing on our sector brief that we've just published. And as I mentioned, this has been published sort of in conjunction with the Nature Action 100. We're publishing a number of these sector briefs, and this is in fact the third of 5. So we've already published one on the pharma and biotech sector, and we published one on chemicals. So this is the third. We've got 2 more to come on food and agriculture and metals and mining. And they are being published to support investors in the Nature Action 100, and of course also in Finance for Biodiversity, engaging with companies in this sector with respect to a company's impacts and dependencies on nature. And effectively what they're aiming to do is to help you in your engagements with those companies. They're setting out key actions that investors should be expecting the companies to take, depending on their maturity level, and that's something that we'll sort of talk about in a little more detail in a moment. They set out questions that you can use in your due diligence and in your engagement discussions with the companies, and also a little bit like Shelley did, but in a bit more detail, setting out supporting resources for investors sort of across the whole supply chain, areas where you can find more information, see what companies should be doing, and also find information about investor engagement activities as well. Now, one of the challenges with producing a nature guide, nature engagement guide on this sector, is that actually it's quite broad, and quite sort of quite a variety of different activities which have very different nature impacts and dependencies, depending upon where you are in the value chain and what activity you're looking at. Now, this particular diagram comes from the TNFD. They've produced an excellent guide on forestry pulp and paper back in 2024 with lots of useful information in it. And they set out here a diagram of the value chain covering the sort of the inputs into the system, and then the production and manufacturing in terms of the packaging companies themselves, and the downstream sort of use of those products. Now, you can see from this diagram that they're covering a slightly broader range of sort of activities than we've actually covered in this brief. So if you really want to draw the picture broadly, you can have a very comprehensive and quite diffuse value chain. The brief that we've published focuses on sort of the forestry activities upstream, including sort of sawmill and wood production activities, and turning that into paper and pulp, and then the paper and pulp, paper-based manufacturing, paper-based packaging, sorry, and then of course expanding that out to look at the packaging that comes from other sources, so plastics, metal and glass. We haven't focused on the downstream. We need to sort of draw the line at some stage, but we've got sort of other guides that will refer to that as well, and clearly there's a lot of other information out there too if you're looking at companies sort of further down the supply chain making use of the packaging. And in fact, our sort of food and agriculture sector brief will of course intersect with this one to an extent, because food manufacturers are one of the biggest users of packaging, as you may be aware. Now, in terms of the material impacts on nature that come from this broad sector, as I say, it depends very much where you're looking in the value chain as to sort of what the impact is likely to be and how serious it's likely to be. Fairly obviously, I think if you're looking at the forestry end, the sort of upstream end of the supply chain, then it's going to be area of land use, which is going to be the most material impact. And Shelley was sort of alluding to this, including, of course, the fact that you can have areas that are maintained as forest but are degraded, even if not actually deforested. And that will be a particularly significant challenge for the sort of the forestry end of the supply chain. Other material impacts, non-GHG air pollutants, other biotic resource extraction. Again, that's a fairly obvious one. The whole point about the business is that it is extracting biotic resources, in other words, timber. So you're chopping trees down, that's bound to have a negative impact on nature. The theory is, again, as Shelley was saying, that what you do is you replace the trees that you cut down with more trees, and you maintain or even enhance the biodiversity within the forest as you're doing that. But of course, that's something that requires a certain amount of sort of examination. It's not something that will automatically be happening. When you look at the packaging part of the value chain, then the picture is slightly different. Again, you've got non-GHG air pollutants, particularly in relation to the pulp and paper side of things. Solid waste is an issue, particularly again with pulp and paper. But then for plastics and metal, toxic soil and water pollutants tends to be a much greater impact. Now, we've used the Encore database to sort of understand these impacts, and it's worth mentioning here that these are potential impacts. So for each particular company, its actual practical impact will obviously depend very much on what the company is doing and where it is doing it. And that's something that the sector brief discusses in quite a lot more detail, how you can actually sort of assess a particular company. So in a sense, what we're flagging here is more a list of sort of alerts, a list of things that you should be looking for, but not necessarily something that you will find with any particular individual company. Now, in the sector brief, we set out these heat maps, which have, as I say, been derived from the Encore database, which assesses nature impacts and dependencies across a whole variety of sectors. And what we've done here is pick out the key components of the value chain that we're covering. So we're looking at logging and silviculture, forestry activities at the upper end of the supply chain, and then through the different packaging manufacturing processes. And you'll see from this diagram that we've divided things up, and this is a sort of structure that we follow throughout the brief, focusing on the manufacture of paper and paper products, peripherally looking at the manufacture of sort of wood, cork, straw, and plaiting materials, plaiting materials, sort of other alternative, if you like, or renewable packaging materials, and then of course looking at plastic products, which will be very important, glass and metal as the key fabric, the key packaging materials that you're likely to encounter. And what you can see there is perhaps no surprise that the really sort of heavy nature footprint, if you want to call it that, is at the upstream end. And you can see the area of land use, emissions of non-GHG air pollutants, and the others coming through there. Whereas when you look further downstream, you can see that manufacture of plastic products, for example, it's the toxic soil and water pollutants that are very high, and the same is also true with metal packaging, whereas a number of the other categories actually coming out as quite low. Now, again, just to sort of to flag, you may have a theoretically low impact, but it may be in practice that a particular company is doing a specific activity in a specific area that means that in that particular place it's having a much more serious negative impact. So it's always important to try and understand what a company is actually doing in a particular location. Flipping it around, looking at the dependencies side, again, I think dependencies are perhaps conceptually sort of easier to take on board. They're things that businesses think about much more naturally from a risk perspective. And again, no surprise to find that the dependencies are higher upstream, particularly for forestry, than they are for packaging manufacturing, where obviously the dependencies tend to be quite a lot more indirect. And so when you look at forestry, in Encore, the dependencies are very high or high on a scale of very low to very high. So right at the top end for a really extremely long list. And this covers pretty much sort of most of the ecosystem services that you're likely to sort of be thinking about. Forestry depends upon those ecosystems working well and providing those services to the business. Now, it's important, of course, to mention, going back to what Shelley was talking about, that a sustainably managed forestry operation has the potential to actually be enhancing or at least maintaining a whole variety of ecosystem services, potentially including really essentially all this list sort of working in reverse. So it is entirely possible for a really well-run forestry operation to be genuinely sustainable and actually be contributing to nature rather than simply depending upon it and sort of sucking value out of it. But again, that will depend very much on what an individual company is doing in a particular location. So that will be important to examine. Now, within the sector brief, following the pattern that we've adopted in the other sector briefs, we've looked very much at the actions that companies should be taking to provide a sort of a ready reckoner for you when you're talking to individual companies. You can have a sort of a list, an aide-memoire of what you would expect a company to be doing in a particular area. And we've used the well-known ACT-D framework that companies should be assessing, they should be committing, they should be transforming their operations, and then they should obviously be disclosing what they're doing, and in an ideal world, where they're doing it. And we've also, as I think I mentioned earlier, looked at the sort of the actions that might be appropriate for particular companies depending upon their maturity levels. So trying to divide the actions up into those that really you could expect any company to be doing, no matter how early it is on its journey in terms of nature, through to actions that require a much more sort of advanced management system, detailed sort of governance framework, and operational capacity to really put into effect. So companies that are much more advanced, much more mature in terms of their operational structures. And so in terms of the recommended actions, they are divided up into 7 categories. Not a huge surprise in terms of the categories that get covered, because they are to do with sort of the impacts that companies are having on nature and where the dependencies lie. And we've put these into a matrix. So we've also tried to analyze not only how easy it might be for a particular business to do, but also, more importantly, how beneficial that action is likely to be from a nature perspective. So what you'll find in the brief is that we've tagged these actions with sort of priority numbers to indicate high priority from nature, and also something that we believe, in broad terms, obviously, is fairly easy for businesses to do. And clearly those should be the actions that you would expect companies to be sort of picking off first, rather than simply doing the actions that are easy for them, but have relatively little impact or benefit for nature. So that's the layout that you'll find within the sector brief. And you can see there as well that we've also tagged those actions to particular sort of subsectors within the value chain as well, so that if you're talking to a plastics packaging manufacturing company, you can immediately see the actions that are most relevant in that particular area, and you can ignore the things that perhaps are more relevant for forestry companies. Similarly, when we come to the questions side of things, we've allocated them or organized them into a line with the Nature Action 100 framework. So focusing on ambition, assessment, targets, implementation, governance, and engagement with stakeholders. We've designed the questions so that some of them can be used pre-meeting, some of them more likely to be used during due diligence meetings and sort of exchanges with the company. And some of them will be answered simply by disclosures. Others are more complicated questions that will require a sort of more detailed interaction with the company. A lot of the questions will be sector specific, but we have also included general questions, which you'll actually find flowing through all of our sector briefs. Things like, do you have a nature plan? It's pretty important whatever sector you're looking at. So we felt it was useful to include those questions in each sector brief. But obviously, if you refer to more than one of these briefs, you will see a degree of repetition in there. But a lot of the questions are obviously sector specific, designed very much for companies that are operating in the forestry, the paper packaging area of this value chain. They're based or linked to the recommended company actions, and obviously you can use them in a variety of different ways. You could simply go into a meeting and ask some of those questions that were pertinent to the company you're looking at. You could use them to construct a due diligence questionnaire. You could use them to sort of form the basis for some sort of internal scoring system as well. So they have a variety of of alternative uses. There are quite a few questions. There are quite a few actions listed in the engagement brief. We don't expect every company to be doing all the actions. We don't expect every investor to use every single one of the questions. So it's very much designed as a useful smorgasbord for you to pick and choose what is most appropriate for the situation that you're looking at. And then finally, just to flag the supporting resources, the sector brief also includes a variety of bits of information about supporting resources that you can refer to, current investor collaborative engagements, and sector sustainability initiatives that the companies themselves might also be participating in. And again, you can use that as a way of trying to get an understanding of sort of how mature and active a company actually is, the extent to which it's participating in some of these things. So I think that's all I need to say on our sector brief. It will be available to download after this webinar. There is a link there in the slides. These will be distributed afterwards, and you'll be able to find it on the Nature Action 100 website in the investor participant section relatively soon, and also it'll be posted for Finance for Biodiversity members and hub participants on the Finance for Biodiversity members portal. Good. I will stop at that point and hand over to Arthur from Achmea Investment Management, and he is going to talk about some of the lessons learned from sector engagements. So, Arthur, over to you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you very much, Peter, for that kind introduction and the invitation to talk about particularly our plastic engagements that we did over the last 6 years or so. Yeah, so this slide introduces me. I think that's done. We can move to the next one. Indeed, I have a few slides introducing the topic and the reason why investors and particularly also we at Achmea were concerned about plastic pollution in our investment portfolios. These graphs are from the excellent OECD plastic outlook reports, and besides that, there's also from last year an excellent new report from Systemic, an update on their earlier Breaking the Plastic Wave report. So if you're into the topic and interested in more recent material, have a look at those. This graph actually shows the expected exponential growth of plastic production. I think I read once that it was somewhere in the 1970s when the petrochemicals industry found out that besides producing more durable hard plastic products, rigid plastics, there was also potentially a large market for single-use plastics. And you see in this graph actually how they effectively managed to push that strategy through global consumer markets. But if we move to the next slide, you can see that that has quite some negative impacts as well. Plastic, well, we all know about plastic wastes floating through the oceans via our rivers. Plastic waste and ocean pollution is expected to grow by 3 or even 4 times in the next decades to come if we don't manage to bend that trend. And particularly for investors, there's a lot of external costs that we see as a potential risk: costs from pollution, costs from health impacts, waste collection costs. So that's all in all quite substantial. And related to that, there's, I think, an interesting report from Planet Tracker from the last couple of years, laying out all these risks, separating reputational risks and more regulatory risks that are upcoming, even risks from litigation that different groups are starting towards major plastic producer and packaging producer companies. But what's really interesting is that there's also quite a financial risk if you compare market outlooks. So the left side, which is if you talk to petrochemicals companies or packaging producers, they see potential for production of growth, well, along the lines of this figure. But if you also look to the more environmentally cautious, ambitious policy scenario of OECD, where they focus on the opportunities to reduce plastic waste in the end. You see that an approximate 30% of demand reduction is possible if governments manage to implement ambitious policies. So there's I think quite a substantial risk for investors as well if jurisdictions, different geographies manage to indeed move towards the more ambitious policy scenarios, reducing effectively the demand for plastic by reduce and reuse and replace alternatives. So it's good to have more awareness of that and more insights as investors also in how these trends will develop, and to see where how these risks will materialize. Well, all these gave us sufficient reason to engage with a number of companies in our investment portfolios over the last couple of years. From 2019 to 2022, we started an engagement program targeting packaging companies. So Amcor, Berry Global, who over the years now have even merged. Also companies like Mondi, Huhtamäki, and we all asked them about their focus on plastic pollution as a potential risk, their governance on those risks, policies to reduce, for example, single-use and virgin plastic, fossil fuel based plastics. And the data they had on the implementation and the impact of these policies, the way they cooperated on reducing single-use plastics and packaging in their value chain, and the transparency on disclosure. A second project that we did was from 2023 to 2025, where we focused on the consumer goods companies, supermarkets on the one hand, and personal products companies, and as they are more on the user side of packaging for their products. We slightly adjusted the questions, but basically it was also very much about governance of the risks and the policy to reduce their use of single-use plastics, and the alternatives they could find, goals for again reducing the use of virgin plastics, driving more circular solutions. Yeah, I think we can move to the next slide, Peter. So here an example of the companies that we engage with, Henkel and Kimberly-Clark, L'Oreal on the personal product side, also P&G, and then a few supermarkets. And we also added one petrochemicals company to also understand a bit more on the challenges and opportunities a bit further upstream. In this overview, we typically track the progress of companies on our engagement asks. So the different flags visualize the progress that companies made. So all in all, there was quite some good positive impact made by companies, some progress achieved. Peter, if you move to the next slide, I can elaborate a bit more on the engagement results. So here we list a few of our insights and results of the engagement. It was good to see that many of the companies that we talked to indeed acknowledged the risks of single-use plastics, public pressure, investor pressure, also policy developments, of course, both on the side of disclosure like CSRD, but also packaging regulation being enhanced in different geographies, and also, of course, the work that's been done on the Global Plastics Treaty. We saw that companies improved their reduction strategies, were actively looking for alternatives on the material side, also doing a lot on recycling. If we looked at, we also worked quite closely with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, for example, monitoring also their the progress companies made under their global commitment initiative. There we saw that companies had set sometimes quite ambitious targets that were not always met, but still there was quite some progress made. And I think what positive was in the end is that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation continued their global commitment initiative and is still working with many of the brands on new, maybe slightly more specific and more modest targets, but progress is still being made. Overall, we saw that the pricing, so the market conditions for pricing of recycled material versus virgin plastics was very determining on the success of companies to scale up the use of recycled materials, for example. And there we see that there's a substantial need for better regulation that creates a more incentivizing level playing field for the renewable solutions. And that's also a reason that we supported, for example, developments towards packaging regulation, but also joined the business coalition from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and WWF. That is an ambitious coalition working towards or very much supporting the UN Plastics Treaty. So we did mostly company engagement, but also focused on some public advocacy on the side, and thought that particularly that combination was quite effective. I think if we compare the engagement asks that we had to this new sector brief that the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation has drafted, there's a lot of similarities. So we are very pleased to see that new sector brief. I think it's offers much useful information for other investors planning to start or to continue engagement with companies in these crucial value chains. I hope that also through the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation, investors can work together, as that is, I think, typically very effective, also with an eye on policy developments to drive this important topic forwards. Peter, back to you. And of course, if there are any questions, please to respond.
Thanks very much indeed, Arthur. That's really, really helpful. I think congratulations on getting quite a lot of success and a degree of movement. And particularly interested, I think, in your comment about sort of collaborative engagement. I think it's clear that when investors can actually collaborate amongst themselves and also with leading businesses, that you get a degree of movement. And the plastic treaty is a really interesting example, isn't it? Because I think the plastic treaty is slightly stalled at the moment. But the voice from investors and a lot of businesses is actually, no, we really want a global plastic treaty, and we want it to be ambitious, and we want it to be effective. So that's a good example of where effectively the private sector is actually leading, perhaps where governments have slightly feared to tread, and that policy debate is really important. We do have time for a few questions, so if you have any, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'll stop sharing the slides to give an opportunity for people to turn their cameras on and wave their hands if they want to. There are a couple of questions already in the Q&A chat. Shelley, this is actually one from you. Robert Alexandre is saying, I'm surprised by the orange classification for FSC. How many corporates can be green? Agree that FSC mix should be orange, but for FSC FM, if we don't say it's green, then it's hard to incentivize corporates. I don't know whether you have a riposte to that or a sort of extra color.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really great question, and I think I'll offer a little clarification and some additional thoughts. So one, from our perspective, FSC is a necessary but insufficient policy mechanism. So it's great if companies say we have a preference for FSC, or if they are actively ratcheting up the percentage of FSC certified fiber that they're using. But inherent in the FSC system is it's a negotiated, the standard itself is a negotiated outcome. So it's a conversation between industry and other voices within the forestry world to decide on what the standard should be. And if companies who purchase wood products don't have policies that go beyond FSC, that reinforce the best aspects of FSC, what we see in the system itself is a race to the bottom, because you have a whole nother certification system, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative or PEFC, that make it significantly easier for forestry companies to gain certification. And that weaker standard means that a lot of logging companies say, well, it's easier for us to go over here. Why should we go to FSC? And so then they are working, they would prefer that FSC be weaker and easier to achieve. And so if we want actually the scientific rigor and the best outcomes for forests, which in turn mitigates financial risk, you need companies who are purchasing wood products to have specificity in what they will and will not accept that reinforces FSC and in many regards goes beyond it.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. So FSC good, but companies can do even better. Is the sort of the simple message. So yeah, we're not downgrading FSC, but we're definitely wanting companies to be even more ambitious than that. There's another tree-related question from Christina. And Arturo, I don't know whether this is maybe more one for you than Shelley, because it has to do specifically with deforestation rather than forest degradation. But the question is, companies declare a cutoff date for deforestation. Typically, it has already passed. In theory, therefore, they should have eliminated deforestation. Could you help us understand this information? This is also a question addressed in the CDP Forest questionnaire. So yeah, how does one deal with a situation where a company has set a cutoff date for 2024 or something like that, or in 2025 it could be now, and it's not clear that they've actually eliminated deforestation? Does the sort of cutoff date have any meaning? How do you handle that when you're looking at companies, Arturo?
Maybe Shelley can respond in more detail, but I think the cutoff date refers to the date that the latest date that any deforestation or conversion is admitted to have taken place. So the earlier, actually, the better. And I think there's guidance also in EUDR going back to 2020, if I'm not mistaken. But Shelley, do correct. So cutoff dates that are in the future are extremely risky, I would say, and not desirable. And you can clearly see, I think, the ambition level of companies in the cutoff date that they use, and I think it should be 2020 or earlier, the better. To be anywhere credible. If it's below or weaker than EUDR standards, I think you should aim to avoid.
Shelley, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's confusing to see what that and to understand what that actually means. But Arturo is absolutely right that a cutoff date, it's not about when they're going to apply their policy. It's about when was an area last deforested or logged. And so FSC's cutoff date is 1995, which means that any area that had been deforested prior to that is still acceptable within the system, but anything that has been cleared after that is not. And likewise, the EUDR, the cutoff date is 2020.
That's really helpful. So I think perhaps, Christina, the answer to your question is it all depends on what the cutoff date sort of aligns to. If you're looking for sort of making sure you're not using products from land where deforestation has occurred in the past, then the cutoff date there will be important and the past date is relevant. If you're looking to a company that's saying its ambition is to stop having any products coming from anything relating to deforestation by a date in the future, then if the date has gone past and they don't seem to still be having a supply chain that is free of deforestation, then that's much more of an issue. But that will be something that you could only really find out in discussion with the company, because their reporting may not give you the proper answer. I think that was it in terms of questions. Robert Alexandra also mentions the EU regulation on packaging and packaging waste, EU PPWR, as a very important regulation, and one that sort of deserves investors' support. It actually applies from August this year, so this coming August, and sets mandatory sustainability rules and rules for recycling and the use of recycled material in inputs. So it's a pretty important regulation. It does actually get discussed in the sector brief. So if that's something that you're not familiar with, then you can have a look at the sector brief and get a quick sort of overview on that. But there's plenty more to be dug out. Look at the EU website if you're really into hardcore examination of regulation. I don't think there are any other questions. Shelley, Arthur, I don't know whether there are any final comments that you want to sort of throw into the pot before we close.
Shelley,
No
on your
need
side?
if not. No, all good. Fantastic. Well, look, thank you very much indeed, everybody, for your attention today. And as I say, the sector brief will be available on the members portal for Finance for Biodiversity and Hub members, and on the Nature Action 100 investor participant area fairly shortly. But I wish you all a great rest of the day, whether that be the morning or the afternoon, depending on where you're calling from. And thanks again to Arthur and Shelley for your contribution. Take care, everybody.